just a quick note about myself. I am primarily trained as a trauma researcher, um, doing a lot of research in things like cognitive neuroscience and trying to understand the basis of things like post-traumatic stress disorder. About 5 years ago or so, I think like many of my colleagues and some of those who are on the call today, we've begun wondering about ways that we can have a greater impact on populations who are in need of mental health services at a very large scale, and thinking about ways that we can take the research that has generated such important findings about how to support people in the aftermath and during crises, but on a large scale. And when we start to think about the ways in which we can reach large populations of people, one begins to think about how do you fill those gaps? And one of the main things I'm going to be focusing on today are thinking about innovative strategies that we can leverage in order to bridge the gaps between the many numbers of people who may be experiencing mental health issues or may be at risk for mental health issues, especially during forced migration, and how we could open up more opportunities of support that go beyond our specialists. So thinking about, in addition to psychiatrists and in addition to psychologists, who else can we potentially train to be part of our communities responding to people in need of mental health support, especially during times of humanitarian crises? And how do we use digital strategies as a way to enhance that work? So I'm going to talk about a few things very quickly, and I'll just say at the very beginning, I'm going to cover a lot in a short amount of time. I'm going to have my email address at the end of this talk. If anyone has any questions about what I presented or needs clarification, please email me. I hope this is the start of many conversations and not the one time you can hear about this work. So please do contact me. What I'd like to briefly introduce today is this idea that we need to transform how mental health care is delivered globally, that there is not enough individuals who are specialists to provide all of the care that is needed. So how do we reimagine? How do we rethink mental health strategies? And can one of those strategies be what we call task sharing? And that basic idea, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is identifying community leaders or people like teachers, healthcare workers, other people who work in communities, even though they are not trained as professional psychiatrists or psychologists, can they provide basic forms of psychological support to communities in need? And as I said before, how can we use digital tools as a way to scale that up in a very rapid way when we need to? Critical to this idea, though, is how do we make sure that the non-mental health specialists, people like teachers or health workers, how do we make sure that they are prepared to do this work? And what kinds of digital tools can we use to ensure that they have the competencies that they need to provide care to other people? We now know globally that approximately 1 out of 20, 1 out of 25 people are going to be experiencing a mental health condition at some point. We also know in many parts of the world, there are approximately one specialized professional for approximately every 100,000 people. And in times of forced displacement, when there are humanitarian crises, and when there's no access to hospitals and clinics, that disparity between people who are in need and the availability of care continues to widen. So there is an urgent global health issue requiring us as a mental health field to figure out ways that we can work together to reduce these gaps, to ensure that people who are in need of support are able to get it. And we've known this for many years now. The World Health Organization, probably about a decade ago, anticipated that by 2020, the leading cause of disability worldwide was going to be anxiety, depression, and other mental health and neurological disorders, outpacing just about every other non-communicable disease. So what do we do about this? And I just want to thank the organizers again today for creating these kinds of dialogues where we can bring people from different lenses and different perspectives to begin to think about this for current issues as well as into the future. Now, there's many fields thinking about these issues. Where I find myself working most are with people who identify themselves as doing what we call global mental health work. And what I think global mental health means is this idea really of equitable mental health. That when we think about health in general around the world, we want to make sure that mental health is a part of that definition, and then developing and implementing strategies that ensure that everyone has access to good care backed by science and practice. And that's also culturally aligned with people's values, their beliefs, their backgrounds, in a way that makes sense to them, and that will be most helpful for the kinds of challenges that they're going through. Now, there's many ways that we could think about addressing these major public health gaps in mental health. Part of the solution, I believe, is also more training in specialists. I believe we need more and more psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers throughout the world. I think that's part of it, and making sure that there's funding available on that global level. Another strategy that's been championed by the World Health Organization and other international bodies has been this idea of task sharing. And without going into the entire history of it, initially this idea was really tested in the training of primary care doctors who were routinely seeing people with mental health issues, but who did not necessarily have extensive training in this field. And of course, it's been shown that in a relatively short amount of time, you can teach primary care doctors and other healthcare workers to become quite good at identifying people in distress and helping to make those diagnoses, and then connecting them to other resources that might be available in their community. But part of what was so important about this work is that there's so much stigma in the world around talking to a mental health professional, that when we can train other trusted members of the community, that actually might increase the likelihood that someone experiencing depression or post-traumatic stress might actually talk to someone about the kinds of issues that they're dealing with. We've now seen over the last couple of decades that we can train people to address a wide range of conditions, from very common mental health conditions to more specific ones like substance abuse and stress-related issues. And we can also develop these kinds of strategies for across the lifespan, including children, new parents, older adults. And in many ways, this is really just the beginning of understanding the range of individuals that we can support and the range of community stakeholders who could be a part of this work. Does this work? And so recent meta-analyses and literature reviews are showing that by and large, they do. When you look at these interventions compared to a control group, and I think they're getting better and better as we get, I would say, even better at how we train people to do this, we're seeing increases in the efficacy of these interventions, providing what I believe is a pretty solid knowledge base showing that this is not the only strategy. We can't stop relying on psychiatrists and psychologists and other trained professionals. But in a world where we need so much support, there is good data being produced that this turns out to be one effective strategy that we can leverage. Now, we are seeing the development of a number of task sharing interventions. The one that my research team works with mainly, although we use a few, but the one we're using mostly right now in our research trials is called Problem Management Plus. Problem Management Plus was developed to train non-mental health specialists to provide 5 sessions of different kinds of very basic forms of support that all build on each other. So you get an introduction, you learn how to take big problems and shrink them into smaller ones, behavioral activation to keep people motivated. You teach people about the importance of social support and then thinking about the future and planning for the future. And again, this intervention is not delivered by psychologists or psychiatrists. It's delivered by lay people in the community who've been trained in this intervention. And each session builds on one another, and each session is 90 minutes in length. People are using Problem Management Plus throughout the world. This is just some photographs from some research that we're currently doing to support Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. And just to show the bottom right corner on my screen where you see people's hands up in the air, just to say this was the beginning of COVID when we were doing all of this work outside and with masks on. But you can see the pride of the people who we've been trained. So the women that we trained in this picture in the bottom, you can see how proud they are for learning this intervention. And then you can see them delivering this intervention to other women in their community. And what I also love about this picture are the little children there as women are taking care of each other. You know, they're there outside in gardens and patios, you know, while they're supporting one another with the distress that they're experiencing. I want to talk about 2 things very quickly. The first big question is, if we are to rethink how we deliver mental health, how do we make sure that those people are ready to do that work? And this is what we call competency-based research. There's a lot of ways to find out if people are ready to do this work. What we focus on is role play research, where we have a set of digital tools where we ask people to watch videos of people experiencing different kinds of distress, and then we can watch how people respond to those situations to see if in fact they have learned the things that we've tried to teach them in our trainings. The one that we use is called ENACT, or Enhancing Assessment of Common Therapeutic Techniques, which was developed by my colleague Brandon Court and other people from the World Health Organization. Essentially what you do is we have a set of different targets, different role plays that we ask people to do, and we can assess on each of those domains whether or not they've integrated those skills in a way that aligns with what we were trying to teach them. We do this before we train people, we do this during the trainings, and we do it after. And we can actually sit with our trainees to look at their data, and we can talk about where they need additional support before they go out into the community to start delivering things like PM+. And so ideally, from either a programmatic level or a research perspective, this is ideally what we're thinking about: the identification of non-specialists and then using these competency assessments throughout the entire training and then throughout supervision once people begin to deliver these task sharing interventions. Now, we were doing things like Problem Management Plus for a long time in person, and then of course, and this is where a big focus on the digital comes into play, then COVID hit. And we were unable, first of all, to provide care to people in person because of the pandemic. And secondly, we knew we needed to find strategies to train people remotely. So usually interventions are developed in places like Western Europe or Eastern Europe or the US, and then they are exported to other parts of the world. We did a sort of reverse form of learning here, where most of the research on task sharing has been done in the global south and in low and middle income countries. And we really looked to that research to inform how do we bring something like Problem Management Plus to New York during the beginning of COVID, and how can we adapt what people did in places like Nepal, let's say, and turn it into something that we can use in New York City by training people who work at community-based organizations to remotely deliver this kind of intervention safely and effectively. Now, we started to do this work in about June April, May, June of 2020, so really at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but we spent a lot of time thinking about how to make our virtual trainings interesting and immersive and engaging in a way that people felt like they were actually getting an in-person training. And just to show you a little bit of data before I wrap up, we have two sets of data. The first, this is the very beginning, where we had our very first attempt to do Problem Management Plus in New York City remotely, where we had non-mental health specialists delivering this 5-session intervention to people in the community at the beginning of the pandemic. You can see a nice reduction in distress and depression and anxiety. This is a measure of distress after each of those 5 sessions, and you can see that as people went through Problem Management Plus, we saw a nice decline in how distressed people felt. Again, remember, this is only a 5-session intervention. We also found that if you look at each person in this study, depression went down for almost everyone, and the same with anxiety, and we found that quality of life significantly increased. This is hot off the press, not totally done yet, but brand new data that I just wanted to share from a kind of follow-up single-arm trial that we are conducting. You can see that those distress scales before and after, this was all done digitally, remotely, by non-mental health professionals working at community-based organizations in the city. We see this nice decrease in distress, as well as depression, and as well as generalized anxiety, and even around alcohol and alcohol use. This is some additional data on quality of life across different domains and functioning as well, or impaired functioning. Before I finish, I just want to say we did some qualitative interviews with people. These were from the people that we trained in PM Plus, and I think I'll just leave it at this to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and then for our other speaker. But the trainees, the people who we trained, who work at very different kinds of community organizations, many who work with people who are immigrants and refugees in New York, they say this really is a major shift, because as long as people have experienced suffering, people have always taken care of each other. But now we're learning tools to know how to do this in a way that's aligned with, best practices. And I love this one where people say you should write this across the sky for the entire community. So please continue to stay in touch. We are now doing a large randomized controlled trial where we're going to be looking at a lot of research outcomes. And hopefully over the next couple of years, we'll continue to publish a lot on this topic. But thank you all very much for your time. I will turn it back over to Eric and Arena and to our other colleagues for any questions before we go on to our next speaker. But here's my email address, and please feel free to get in touch if I can answer any more questions.
brownad@newschool.edu. Thank you. Thank you, Adam, for such a comprehensive overview. And in this day and age, and especially in Ukraine, I think there may be a lot of interest in PM Plus. But if I may, and I would not take away any time from the audience, but the foremost question actually is kind of twofold. You introduce yourself as a trauma researcher, and you're speaking to a country that is in war or dealing with the immediacy of war. So how to tailor this to a trauma-affected population that is not in the aftermath or in the just some preliminary thoughts on this, Adam, if you wish.
Sure, Eric. It's a great question. And so the way that my team and I think others think about mental health and psychosocial strategies during crisis, during a humanitarian crisis, during war, we think about stepped models of care. So you're right that many people during a ongoing or protracted trauma are not in a position to necessarily be going through weekly types of therapy, even if it's something like Problem Management Plus. So what we typically recommend is something like psychological first aid training and some very brief interventions where people are broadly trained to know how to help people in acute forms of distress. And so there we focus on things like, how do you notice when someone is in distress? How do you listen in appropriate ways? And then how do you connect them to existing resources, if there are any, should they be experiencing, very severe mental health issues, or if they're in danger to themselves or others? Once there are either places or moments of greater stability and people are continuing to experience either ongoing or chronic forms of stress or trauma, that's when we begin to think about two levels. Perhaps a band of people who would benefit from Problem Management Plus, and maybe that's enough to help stabilize that individual. And if they need more care, then they can go on. Or there are people whose levels of distress are so high that they immediately need specialized care. But I think what we need to be thinking about is, instead of the binary, either you need a hospitalization or a psychiatrist or nothing, how do we think about more tiers in a system where we begin with an immediate sort of psychological first aid in the middle of a crisis, and then we begin to think about different pathways depending on the needs.
Great. I see a message here. We have translated PM Plus into Ukrainian and trainings provided from 2015. Who can
That's
speak to
amazing.
that? Who can speak to that message?
Orest.
Sorry?
Orest.
Orest, could you speak to that, please? Orest, if you wish, the one that just posted this message. Could you raise your voice?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much for presentation. Excuse me, because the question of Professor Chaban was first, but I just want to have like training was provided from 2015 at the east of the country when war began. But I saw the lack of trainers, and also like not widespread wave of training. So whole time discussion about training, who could provide education and training. So we are feeling the lack, and this is just my comments. Thank you very much.
And Orest, if I would love to keep this conversation going. So some of the things we're starting to do, not necessarily in Ukraine, but would love to talk about this, is creating networks of PM Plus trainers. So if there are people in the Netherlands or in Germany or in other places who are trained in PM Plus, they might be able to deliver that to people in Kiev, and thinking about ways of creating networks of people who can deliver these kinds of interventions and to create these robust networks.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. We have, I think a question of Professor Chaban is corresponding with what just Orest said, because his question was like, what are the criteria, how you choose those leaders from the communities? And maybe that's one of the reasons why we had those trainers, but there was no kind of scale up. I don't know, what is your experience? Sorry, just a second.
Sorry, if all the others can mute their microphones.
There's not an exact science, but what we do have a kind of a set of criteria that I can follow up with people about. What, we're looking for some characteristics for people who might be good candidates to train in PM Plus. But the main thing is that we work with local NGOs or other organizations who have strong ties to the local communities, and they know who are people who are respected, who are trustworthy people, who have good speaking skills, good emotional boundaries, who also will be hopefully in the community for a period of time, and who are already working with people on a daily basis, who probably experience distress. So again, if it's a teacher, if it's a health worker, if it's, they're already doing this work, and they're in many ways looking for something like PM Plus because it will help them do their work more effectively.
Maybe Oleg, you wanted to comment on this because it's your question. Any additional thoughts or questions you wanted to add to this? I'd like to hear your voice too.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eric. Indeed, I would like to say thanks to Adam for the fantastic presentation. And Indeed, now we have quite a lot of demand for such work, and I've been hearing requests even from large companies who are ready to support this project on the provision of psychological first aid by non-mental health specialists, either interns or I really like this idea with the community leaders. Using the opportunity, I am inviting now Mr. Brown to take part in our project. And if you don't mind, we would be happy to discuss it later. So my experience is influenced through priests, specifically on this stage of preparing the chaplains. Back in 2015, you might know that the war in Ukraine started in 2014. Just in 2022, it became large scale and total. But the university, a theological university, contacted me asking to prepare priests to face trauma in war zones. So I had a certain dilemma. When I was teaching them knowledge on psychology, psychiatry with scientific data, when I was training them, I understood that, well, their interpretation will be theological. They do not become psychologists, they do not become psychiatrists, so they do not have this objective. They just process the knowledge I give, and they provide it the way they understand from their religious point of view. So later, when I went to the war zone, I was doing science, I was adapting PSL 5 to our realities, and I met those chaplains right there in the war zone. They were coming and saying, thank you. Now we see that we start making impact. We save the souls of our soldiers. So I asked them how. They respond with some theology, but I understand that they just use their terms to do what we've taught them. So you see, I provided some material, they processed it through their identity, through their faith, through themselves, and they call it with different words, but the effect is the same. So I fully agree and concur that indeed quick scale up of our knowledge, identifying the conditions early, it really requires lots of work at community level, but now it's difficult. It is very difficult, and that's why I asked this question: how do we find them? Just coming there and asking, okay, who is your mayor? It's something. But for example, they might be also busy with other work. They need to be motivated somehow. It's important not to just find them, but to motivate them so that they would really work in mental health. This is it from me so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Any responses, Adam?
This has been the critical issue that we're thinking about in two ways. One is, how do we apply for funding, to different grant organizations and foundations to make sure that we can help to incentivize people to help do this work. But the other thing, which I think is a bigger cultural issue, is how do we actually create pipelines and occupations and jobs where part of what a person does is to deliver mental health and psychosocial interventions. So imagine if you're hiring someone as a healthcare worker or as a teacher or something, and 25%, not for every single teacher, not for every single healthcare worker, but let's say out of 100 that you hire, 10 of them, 8 of them are trained in problem management plus, and they have a percentage of their time allocated to doing this work. But this is where I think policy on an international level needs to begin to change if we are very serious about really integrating these strategies into different sectors. The problem is, as you were saying, we can't just add more and more work to what people do. And quite honestly, most of the people who do this work are women. And so what we'll find is that women who are already doing so much work are now going to be asked to do even more work, what we need to do is, I think, have a concerted push where we're advocating for different ways of funding these types of positions. And that, I think, will lead to a more equitable and sustainable way of getting these kinds of interventions implemented.
Thank you, Adam, for that eloquent and comprehensive overview. I just wanted to give the floor to Ina. Ina, you just said thumbs up or on response to Oleg in the discussion. Anything you wanted to add to that, Ina? Ina Korchikova?
Добрый вечер. Да, я
Good
просто...
evening. Yes, I was listening to the professor, and I agree that indeed the question, how do we find these leaders, and how do we keep how we keep people who need this care around these leaders? It's true. If we only say that, yeah, people who need help, okay, there is this person, they can help them. I mean, in Ukrainian mentality, probably it's not as effective. And also, my question would be, who will provide support and supervision to these community leaders? Because they also might face burnout and so on.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question, Ina. Adam?
Благодарю.
These are exactly all the questions that I think, and maybe this is why I find this research so interesting and important, because we're working out all of these details. I mean, these are the things that we are trying to figure out exactly to that point. How do we create sustainable pathways for doing this work? And Ina, to your point, part of this, I think, is also thinking about training differently. When we train the next generation of mental health professionals, maybe we're not just training them to deliver care, but we're also training them to supervise these types of programs, which would be something that would be very new in the field of psychology, very new in the field of psychiatry. We've never done this before. And really, I think we need all of you to be a part of this conversation, with exactly your points. How do we do this in a way that people will trust the people who are trained in the community? And then how do we make sure we have the availability of supervisors to ensure that the people who are trained are getting the support that they need? Otherwise, I agree with you. I don't think it will be effective unless we can really figure these things out. And at the moment, I'll just say, a lot of this work is when PM Plus works well, Problem Management Plus works well, it's because there's a lot of research money behind it to pay for the supervisors, to pay the people delivering it. And I think what we need to figure out is, great, so when PM Plus can happen, it works well, but how do we think about doing this in context where there may not be a lot of research money supporting it? And I think that's a huge question that hopefully with all of you, we can, begin to think about.
Sure.
One last question. I want to circle back to Orest, who posted that PM Plus has been translated. Orest, how did you learn about PM Plus back in 2015? I'm just curious to know.
Thank you very much. So it was provided by international organizations working at the East, and they had trainers. If I am not mistaken, International Medical Corps or Médecins Sans Frontières translated this into Ukrainian and provided trainings, but it was enough. So we still are looking for this to make it wider. Yeah, thank you.